met a girl lost in a book, dreaming the past. Follow, she said, and jumped in a page. She smiled and she asked. Walked to Glenfinnan, waited with Charlie. We drank an old Leith, we were toasted by Robbie. We stood as they signed in our broth at the Abbey. She took me to places that I never thought you could see.
Hi, and welcome to episode 6 from Random Scottish History for Independence Live. I thought since summer is basically Pride season that we would have a wee look at how those who found themselves attracted to the same sex have been treated throughout our history. With Mardi Gras just having taken place in Glasgow there, I did turn up in my rainbow unicorn onesie to see them off, but I was between two 10-hour night shifts. So bed was a-calling me and I wasn't able to spend the day with them, I'm afraid. The result of my research into this has really outlined how this was very much a men's rights issue throughout the centuries. Women weren't really looked into because it wasn't illegal for two women to be with each other. I don't know that the men of the time could conceive of female sexuality and the idea that a woman might want to be in a relationship with another woman, that they perhaps wondered how a satisfying sexual life could be had if there was no man involved. So there wasn't legislation enacted against women in quite the same way as it was enacted against men. Men caught with each other, however, were tagged with the biblical label of sodomites, and they were charged with buggery, which could land them a death sentence up until just a couple hundred years ago. In 1980, it was finally legalised here in Scotland, which is super recent. I don't feel I need to go into a description of what buggery is for you. Sodomy, however, carried very different connotations. The Christian Church is who really set the tone for the last 2,000 years on how people were to view their sexual lives. Sodomy was any sexual act between two people of whatever gender that didn't lead to pregnancy. So sodomy was any sexual act, even between one man and one woman, that wasn't going to lead to pregnancy, that didn't have the end result in a child. So every aspect of foreplay came under the term sodomy, and the church forbade that. There were a lot of articles coming out from England and elsewhere of men being charged with sodomy. It became a bit of a witch hunt during the early 1700s. I wasn't able to find any mentioned in Scotland from the papers up until about 1849, when there was a case from Nairn. Now, it's not because the papers were too reticent to publish such things. The papers saw themselves as almost a moral compass, that in reporting and detailing these crimes, not only were they acting a part to serve shame and publicity to the people involved, but it also acted as a warning, a preventative from others who might have the idea to do the same. So the papers were reporting on these cases with almost delight. They got into details, they didn't shirk from that. I think the reason you didn't get cases coming out of Scotland had its origin in our first episode for Independence Live, where we dealt with marriage and relationship customs in Scotland. it was just the done thing to have the family, the 2.4 kids, get married, etc. There wasn't the same opportunities for people to explore relationships outside of what was considered the norm. Whereas in England's big cities, you had private gentlemen's establishments that allowed and gave privacy to these occurrences between men, these relationships. You didn't have quite the same way of life in Scotland. The majority were working class. Even had there been these private gentlemen's clubs, they wouldn't have had the wherewithal or the means to become members. So they were also small towns and villages where everyone knew each other's business. So you couldn't really get away with anything considered abnormal by society without it coming to the notice of people and being talked about. I feel like men either just repressed who they were, got them wife, had the 2.4 kids, and just did what they needed to get through life, or they would become unfulfilled bachelor types who just kind of retired from the world, were seen as a wee bit eccentric, etc. Prior to newspaper reporting, there were only a few instances noted as having taken place in Scotland. So we had the 1st of September 1570, where John Swan and John Lister were executed. 2nd of April 1630, Michael Erskine was executed. The 8th of December 1645, Gavin Bell was prosecuted, and on the 9th of September 1662, Charles II came out with his Act of Indemnity and Pardon. So we'll get into them a wee bit. Sir Archibald Allison, in his Principles of the Criminal Law of Scotland 1832, tells us about the first two of these. The crime of sodomy, or the unnatural connection of one man with another, is to be proved after the same manner and with the same scrupulous attention as rape. Proof of the completion of the offence by penetration is equally indispensable in both. If the party on whom the offence is committed is a boy under 14, he is not guilty of felony, but the actual agent only is exposed to its pains. The guilty associate is a competent witness against the panel. Two old cases, John Swan and John Lister, 1st of September 1570, and Michael Erskine, April 2nd, 1630, occurred for this crime, in both of which the accused were executed, to which we must add that of James Lecky, Jedburgh, autumn 1827, who was charged with no less than 9 acts, and on a confession of 2 and on restriction of the libel, was transported for life. James Lecky's case doesn't appear in the papers at the time at all under any search parameters, which is actually really strange. I'm not sure if he was a noted person who was able to keep his name out the press. We do have notice of Gavin Bell's case within the Parliamentary Register, where the authorities of Linlithgow were given the right to execute him. Charles II's Act of Indemnity and Pardon didn't extend to certain crimes. Obviously, people who had anything to do with his father, Charles I, being beheaded weren't going to find a pardon within this act, but neither were people convicted of sodomy. The Caledonian Mercury for the 3rd of August 1721 has something similar after the 1715 rebellions in Scotland. All treasons, misprisions of treasons, libels, riots, and all other offences committed before the 24th of July, 1721, against His Majesty's crown and dignity, by any persons, spiritual or temporal, are by the said act acquitted, pardoned, released, and discharged, except such as were in arms in the late rebellions, and that are gone beyond seas, or that are attainted of high treason, all voluntary murders or robberies, rapes, sodomy, buggery, piracies in the high seas, counterfeiting the stamps, exchequer notes, seamen's tickets, perjury, subornation of perjury, all arrears of the land and malt taxes, customs, excise, or any other branch of the revenues, as also all offences by popish recusants. So you wonder what was actually pardoned. So the very fact that this crime was included along with high treason and murder shows to what extent it was viewed by society. The really terrible punishments, however, seem to be handed out outside of Britain. The Caledonian Mercury report from Paris for the 29th of May 1726 has: a person convicted of sodomy was on the 4th instant burnt alive by virtue of the sentence passed upon him by the Judge of Chasselet. The Caledonian Mercury follows up on the 16th of June 1730 by telling us that 22 persons convicted of sodomy have been publicly executed in Holland, and 'tis believed some persons who were missing and suspected are privately executed. That news continues a week later, for the same paper, the 22nd of June 1730. Many of the persons accused of sodomy in Holland are come over hither in passage boats for their safety, and we learn by private letters and passengers that besides the 28 that were lately executed there, 15 more are to be hanged next Thursday, and a Dutch parson to be burnt alive at Rotterdam. 'Tis added that there were great tumults in Holland on account that some of the greatest of them, as to fortune, had not been publicly executed. The estates of those who are fled, as well as those executed, besides what pays their debts, we hear, are all forfeited to the public. I can't think that the refugees would have found themselves any safer in England during this time. It was truly a witch hunt scenario in Holland and elsewhere. The first allusion to the idea homosexuality might be a curable illness is also given at this time. We have, again from the Cali Mercury for the 25th of June 1730, a young man who had the foul disease, applying himself to a surgeon for cure, the surgeon, from a motive of suspicion, refused to take him under his care unless he would tell him the occasion of his malady, which he accordingly did, and likewise impeached a gang of sodomites, and the houses they frequented, which, coming to the ears of the ministers of Amsterdam, they made strong representations to the magistrates for public justice to be inflicted on the guilty, adding that without it their preaching would be in a manner useless, upon which numbers of them were immediately taken up, who impeached one another. You can see the parallels. I had a friend in high school who bravely came out to his super-religious parents, and their first port of call with him was to their family doctor. Again, the whole conversion thing lies with religion, as it's mainly the religious or those who've been brought up in super-religious households that consider conversion therapy to be at all a go-to. They're brought up to believe it's an abnormal inclination. Homosexuality is not a learned behaviour. The idea that it's an abnormal inclination is what is the learned behaviour. The church and religion have a lot to answer for in this regard. Thereafter, we have reports continuously out of London of men impeaching each other and outing their accomplices in this witch hunt of theirs. The Cali Mercury for the 7th of July 1730 has, we hear that Emmanuel Ruffle, committed last Monday for sodomy, has since impeached several of his wretched accomplices, some whereof have since been taken up, and diligent search is making after the rest. It is said this gang consists of 30 or 40 of those vile wretches. Cali Mercury for Tuesday 28th of July 1730. Yesterday one Mr. Hayes was committed to the new jail in Southwark for sodomy, and we hear he has impeached 7 of his accomplices. The persecution in Holland was making the papers a lot during this time, varying people having fled the persecution, escaped the public hangings. The Cali Mercury for the 1st of September 1730. has touching the great and notorious sodomite, etc., mentioned in our last, to be arrived here incognito, we have the following account of him from the Hague of the 1st instant, that the week before the date, a Dutch minister at Viana, 3 leagues from Utrecht, absconded by night from that place, being accused of sodomy, not only by and with some of those who have been lately executed, but by others whom he has endeavoured to seduce to that unnatural crime, in which 'tis said he was so hardened that 'tis said he has attempted to prove from passages of Scripture that it was not only not a sin, but a practice more acceptable to the deity than the love of woman, which is going to have ruffled some feathers. It goes on, they take it to kind of great lengths in Holland. For the 22nd of September for the same year, we have it, the arch-hypocrite Morin and others, accused of the unnatural crime of sodomy, have been cited a second time, and 'tis thought that on their not appearing for their justification at the 3rd citation, that they will be condemned to be hanged in effigy. On the 24th of September 1730, a report from London gives us, on Saturday, Peter Viviana, a poor foreigner, lately come to England and unacquainted with our language, convicted last session at the Old Bailey, on the oaths of John Brailsford and William Pryor, stood in the pillory at the Royal Exchange for attempting to commit the crime of sodomy, when the sheriff's officers suffered him to be treated with great barbarity. The pillory was a real easy go-to up to the start of the 19th century for people accused of this crime, but also those who threatened to bribe another by insinuating that they were that way inclined. That was taken very seriously. We have a reporting here, the Mercury for 31st of July 1735. This afternoon, one Hutchinson stood in the pillory before the Royal Exchange for extorting a watch and money at several times from one Mr. Pack, a mercer's apprentice in Gracechurch Street, by threatening to swear sodomy against him, for which he was pelted for near an hour with such fury that I hear he has lost one or both his eyes, and is sadly bruised. Another punishment that was considered is brought to us from the Mercury for the 22nd of December 1735. 'Tis thought it will be proposed to Parliament next sessions to punish murder, robbery, sodomy, and other offences of the blackest dye with burning or breaking upon the wheel, instead of hanging, a death which hardened villains perfectly laugh at. A crazy example of sea discipline is brought to us from Plymouth. The Mercury again, the 25th of November 1742. A very extraordinary kind of sea discipline having been put in practice in this port on board the Princess Amelia, I cannot avoid making it public. 2 men on board the said ship being caught together, and supposed to be guilty of that notorious and detestable sin, sodomy, the captain, in order to reclaim and bring them to shame, the real fact not being fully proved, ordered declaration to be made among the women on board that they should have the correction of those fellows, whereupon near 20 of the Amazonian kind jumped on deck with cat-o'-nine-tails in hand. The men, being seized and stripped, did lay on the stripes so close and with such heavy resentment at the crime, that if they had not soon been taken off, they would have died under their discipline, which is just something straight out The Handmaid's Tale. We have an example of how even the insinuation could drive someone to suicide. From the Mercury for the 7th of August 1755, from a nobleman's steward, who had for some time been observed to be greatly troubled in his mind, after having given some directions to the workmen, went up into his chamber and shot himself through the head. His letter suggests the cause to be rumours of his being sexually deviant. I am innocent of that beastly and detested sin of sodomy, and that I loathe and abhor it as much as any man. I don't write this to vindicate myself to a world I shall soon leave and soon be forgotten, but that your lordship would have that charity not to think the worse of those persons who have laid the imputation on me, and have taken the advantage of my imbecility of spirit. I could bear poverty, but not shame. Now, the go-to of being pilloried was ended after an event that happened in Surrey. It was two men judged to have been guilty of the crime of sodomy that really brought an end to this practice. The Scots Magazine for Saturday the 2nd of December 1780 has, on the 10th of April 1780, Theodosius Reed, a plaisterer, and William Smith, a coachman, sentenced for sodomitical practices, were carried from the new jail privately in a hackney coach to save them from the mob, and set in the pillory at St. Margaret's Hill. The under-sheriffs, with their officers and a great number of constables, attended. The unhappy wretches were, nevertheless, so severely pelted by the populace that in half an hour Smith sunk down, in which position he remained till he appeared black in the face, the blood gushing from his ears when he was taken out and laid on the pillory. When carried back to the jail, a surgeon was sent for, but Smith was found to be dead, and Reed's recovery was doubtful. On an inquisition taken April 12th, it appeared to the coroner and his jury that Reed, turning round faster than usual, and Smith being just then seized with a giddiness and fainting from the extreme severity of the populace, lost the strength of his legs and hung by his head. The jury's verdict was strangled in the pillory. The Solicitor General moved the Court of King's Bench, April 20th, for an attachment against the Under-Sheriff for his not preventing this mischief, but Lord Mansfield, upon hearing the affidavits, said they did not appear to prove any inattention in the Under-Sheriff, so the affair was deferred till further inquiry should be made. Can a country be said to be civilised where such barbarity is committed at midday in the capital? In Nairn we have the first short account of a man sentenced for the crime of sodomy in Scotland, with a rather harsh outcome. From the Banffshire Journal for the 24th of April 1849, Donald Fraser from Glengarry, charged with sodomy or attempt to commit sodomy, and with other libidinous and indecent practices, pled guilty to the attempt to commit the more serious offence, and was sentenced to 10 years' transportation. Then we have the case against Mr. Glenn and his friend Mr. Broadley. This case led to new regulations in Glasgow surrounding private rooms and booths in licensed premises. It comes from the Dunfermline Saturday Press for the 29th of September 1866. That animals worse than brutes are to be found in human form is amply shown by the fact that two men named William Glenn and Maurice Broadley were at this court convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years penal servitude. People are now getting jail time. This case is actually mentioned briefly in the 2015 publication History of Drinking, the Scottish Pub since 1700 by Anthony Cook. In 1866, two young men, William Glenn, a Glasgow slater aged 21, and Maurice Broadley, a Londonderry picture dealer aged 19, were convicted of sodomy in or near a drinking box in a public house in Briggate, Glasgow, and sentenced to 10 years penal servitude. So that got rid of these private booths and any wee nooks and crannies in these licensed premises, I think further afield than Glasgow. Now, while it's a jailable offence now as far as Britain is concerned, someone travelling to Australia gives us a different picture from there. We have a tour around the world by Moncure D. Conway. He writes from Albany, Western Australia for December 12th in 1883. It's reported in the Glasgow Herald for the 22nd of February 1884. I must add that in some of its aspects the Australian community impressed me as retrogressive. Some of their laws are uncivilised. Rape and sodomy are punished with death. In a list of executions, no fewer than 17 have been for rape and 2 for sodomy. A charge of rape is too easily trumped up to render that a just punishment, and though the Australians defend it by saying that their families must often be left unprotected, it is obvious that the severity of the punishment tempts the brutal to silence the victim of their lust by murder. As for the other offence, in punishing which with death Australia differs from all other countries, one can only attribute it to some exceptional cause, the confusion of mind represented in punishing a vice more heavily than many crimes, injurious to others or to the community, the absurdity of punishing a man's injury to himself more severely than his breaking his wife's bones. This is an anomaly that must have some occult connection with convict discipline. There does not appear to be any agitation even for the abolition of these legal monstrosities. We're also told those guilty of these crimes should be considered as having brutalized himself, allowing the judge presiding over such cases to deal with them how he sees fit, much in the same way that Mr. Conway tells us that the crime is man's injury to himself. So from the Glasgow Herald for the 9th of May 1889, we have the Corporal Punishment Bill. Mr. Mulvane, in moving the second reading of this bill, explained that by way of consolidating the law as to flogging, this measure repealed wholly and entirely 3 Acts of Parliament, and repealed portion of 6 others. It amended the law in the first instance by abolishing the punishment of flogging upon incorrigible rogues. It provided that all offenders under the age of 16 years might be punished by whipping, but the whipping was to be administered with a birch rod only. As to adults, the bill would extend corporal punishment to the case of burglars when they were armed with a dangerous or offensive weapon, to persons convicted of rape and of offences under the Criminal Law Amendment Act, and to persons convicted of bestiality and sodomy. In each case, discretionary power would be exercised by the judge as to the infliction of the lash. It might be said that this form of punishment was brutalizing, but in his opinion they could not brutalize the person who had already brutalized himself by the commission of the offences embraced in the bill. About this time there are a lot of reportings coming out from the papers. This is in the latter half of the 19th century, when women's rights and suffrage were being talked about extensively. Those groups promoting equality for women and their rights were slagged off in the press and within houses of parliament as being merely feminine men and masculine women, as though anyone outside of those demographics couldn't possibly be on side. It was their way of demeaning the movement. Fortunately, there was the chance of a happy outcome for some of those who were sentenced with this charge. From the Dundee Courier for the 3rd of September 1870, we have a charge of sodomy. John Kidd and Peter Rattray, residing in Arbroath, were charged with committing sodomy or attempting to commit sodomy in the shop in High Street, Arbroath, on Sunday the 29th of May, occupied by the prisoner Kidd. Both prisoners pleaded not guilty and were defended by Messrs. Charles Scott and Watson as counsel and Messrs. William Smith, Arbroath, and Kidd, Dundee as agents. After a new jury had been impanelled, the Lord Justice Clerk said, "I have to mention on behalf of the court, before proceeding with this trial, that this is a case that must be tried with closed doors, and none can be allowed to remain except those officially connected with the court. Before proceeding, the court must, therefore, be cleared." The court was cleared accordingly, and the trial proceeded with in private. The case lasted until 5:30 in the afternoon. The jury unanimously returned a verdict finding the prisoners not guilty, and they were accordingly liberated. So, it wasn't a given that just because people were so averse to the crime that you were necessarily definitely going to get a guilty charge. When HIV became more prevalent, the homosexual community were told in no uncertain terms that it was their fault. They'd brought the scourge upon themselves for the sin of loving who they chose, but this was by no means a novel accusation. It was just the perpetuation of an old myth. In the past, people saw sin as somehow contagious as well, that if one person sinned, then that whole town or region might find itself affected by God's retribution. So we have an example of that from the Motherwell Times for the 27th of January 1917. Certainty of punishment. There is not a vice, says the famous Fournier of Paris, more fatal to the conservation of the race than promiscuous and unlawful sex indulgence. It was to punish the sins of the flesh that the deluge was sent to destroy nearly the whole human race. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by fire for the same reason is even commemorated in the very name of sodomy to this day. Onan, says the book of Genesis, performed the marriage act in such a way as to frustrate it of its only lawful purpose, the procreation of children. And the Lord slew him. His sin is alive today and is commemorated in the word onanism. On these occasions, God punished the guilty miraculously, but that is not his usual way. Our bodies are so contrived that the violation of the moral and civil laws being a part of their punishment in their train, not the less certain because slower, yes, slower than a miracle would be, the venereal diseases, syphilis, gonorrhea, and soft chancre, come to act as earthly ministers to his justice, anticipating the punishments of a future world. Anyone suffering from the venereal diseases will tell you that the punishment there is quite enough in their experience. One thing I desire to urgently impress on your minds is that perfectly innocent people, young and old, contract venereal disease, and it is the recognition of this important fact which has stirred up modern society to work together to save the innocent from the guilty, and the guilty from the innocent. The anti-homosexual stance was something that was born of religion. The church outlawed everything but sex as quick and unenjoyable as possible that occurred between one man and one woman, purely for the purposes of having children. Religion has a lot to answer for in this regard, as this view became insidious within society, to the point where even though religion has less of a hold than it used to, there are still those who feel that they're not free to just be who they are and love who they choose. That that's still the case is just incredibly sad. A publication, Moths, by Ouida, which was the pen name of Maria Louise Ramey, is reviewed in the John O'Groat Journal for the 16th of July 1897, which makes it clear that, as per usual, it's one rule for the rich and another for everyone else. Those who make acquaintance with Ouida for the first time through Moths will be startled at the way in which she points out and touches the full spots in the lives of many of the aristocracy. To anyone who knows anything of the state of society, the revelation will not appear too exaggerated. Against a social state in which incest is common, where infidelity and adultery are openly and fearlessly indulged in and looked upon as a matter of course, where holy wedlock is merely a convenient device for getting rid of a social difficulty, where the prostitute drives in the park with the duchess, and where sodomy abounds. Against such a society, no sarcasm too pointed, no satire too poisonous can be hurled. Naught but good can come of such an exposure, and it is a gross mistake that these things should be concealed. It is the hidden sin we cannot cope with. When the cobra raises its head, we can strike it off. The only crime that society recognises is the sin of being found out. Do as you like, so long as you keep out the hands of the police, and so long as you avoid an open scandal. The first instance I could find of the term homosexual and the phrase abnormal inclinations having been used was in 1907, in a case from Berlin that was reported by all the papers. Maximilian Harden, an independent journalist, was taken to court for libel after insinuating cronyism and occult practices against Prince Eulenburg, as well as suggesting Count Kuno Moltke and the prince were engaged in acts with each other. Those two attempted to hold Max Holden to account with a charge of libel. Max was, however, judged to be freigesprochen, or acquitted, first time around. After an appeal, he was convicted of the charge. In 1924, prison sentences were still being handed out. From the Scotsman, for the 21st of October 1924, they bring us a heinous crime. Before a sheriff and jury at Stirling Sheriff Court yesterday, two young Stirling men, James Robertson Boswell, clerk, 24 Baker Street, and Peter Conway O'Brien, footman, Bannockburn Road, St Ninians, were tried on a charge of attempted sodomy, alleged to have been committed in the King's Park, Stirling, on the 2nd of August, 1924. The jury consisted of 10 women and 5 men. After hearing evidence in camera, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. An agent for accused asked the sheriff in passing sentence to take into account that there had been nothing against the character of the men before, and also the fact that they had been in prison since the 2nd of August. The sheriff remarked that the crime was one which, both in the eye of the public and in the eye of the law, was very heinous. He passed sentence of 6 months' imprisonment to date from the time of apprehension. There was one gentleman who enjoyed the company of other gentlemen in Scotland, who succeeded in having his sentence reduced. From the Dundee Courier for the 7th of May 1938. 2 years' sentence reduced. The Scottish Court of Criminal Appeal gave judgment yesterday in an appeal by Peter Allen Ogg, an Edinburgh businessman, against a conviction obtained in the High Court on charges of gross indecency with male persons. The jury found the accused guilty by a majority of 2 charges, which included one of sodomy, unanimously guilty of 2 of the charges, with 3 charges not proven. Ogg, who was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment, appealed against the conviction on several grounds. The appeal judges, the Lord Justice Clerk, Lord Mackay and Lord Wark, set aside the conviction on the sodomy charge and on 2 of the other charges, holding that there was an insufficiency of corroboration. As one only of the convictions remained, the court reduced the sentence to one of 9 months' imprisonment. The first report into the homosexual section of society, their way of life, etc., with a view to better acceptance and a review of the laws, took place. It was called the Wolfenden Report, and the earliest newspaper article in relation to the Wolfenden Report is actually a Christian response to its findings. So for the Motherwell Times for the 20th of September 1957, we have Wolf Calls and Wolfenden. This is by Reverend Ian A. Muirhead from the Brandon Church. The Wolfenden Report has had a great deal of publicity. How do some of the general issues raised in it look in Christian eyes? This sort of world. The report plunges into a sort of world, an aspect of society which is for the most part quietly ignored, but it was into this sort of world that the Christian faith first came. The world of the 1st century AD was one of exceedingly loose sexual relations. There is any amount of evidence that in pagan as well as Christian writers it was taken for granted as a normal, inevitable activity of human society. No one really questioned that man's passions should be free to do as they pleased. Rejected. The Christian community rejected this way of life. It declared for its own members an absolute standard of moral purity, and declared too that the immoral were eternally excluded from God's kingdom. It refused to admit that it was normal, natural, or right for society to be immoral, and pronounced the immoral society to be doomed to confusion and destruction. It would take too long to discuss the Church's reasons for this teaching. Briefly, they amounted to this. Sex was far too fundamental and important a part of human nature to be exploited as an instrument of selfish pleasure or excitement. The New Testament champion of this high view of sex and of marriage was St. Paul, though he was only applying and amplifying what he had learned from Jesus. The law. The Christian knows what is the standard for his own life, and knows that he cannot get away with the excuse that he is not made that way. He has also a responsibility to work for the highest possible standards in society. He knows you cannot make people good by Act of Parliament. What an Act of Parliament is for is to be a safeguard. It ought to restrain the wicked and to shield the weak from the perils of their own weakness or of the greed or wickedness of others. Naturally, Christians will sometimes disagree with each other about the best ways of doing this, but always this is the agreed aim, to consider the weak and the foolish and to protect them from the temptation or peril. When the government comes to formulate an Act of Parliament on the matters raised in the Wolfenden Report, the question it will have to face will be, does what is proposed offer the wisest and best protection to the community as a whole, and to its weaker or more foolish members? The Christian looks beyond the report to the age in which he lives, and of which the report is just one feature. He sees that, like the first century, though perhaps less blatantly, it is an age which regards sex chiefly as a means to be exploited for selfish ends, for entertainment, advertising, and so forth. It is an age which desperately needs new ideals for its life. It needs to be delivered from the degradation into which its selfishness, greed and lusts are plunging it more and more deeply. It needs new patterns of human behaviour which will do greater justice to the sort of nature which God has entrusted to men and women. It needs a new creation of its life which can only be attained to in and through the Christian faith. I feel the point needs made that humanity has existed for far longer than the last 2,000 years. That were it to be a God that created humanity and the world for the substantial amount of time prior to the last 2,000 years, if he was so against the freedom of sexuality that this religious man outlines was the case in the 1st century CE, might he have done something about it a bit sooner, perhaps? This is just a case of men in authority seeking to control what really they're unable to control. At the end of 1958, we have a failure to change the legislation off the back of this report due to the fear that homosexuality is something people are recruited into. The Aberdeen Evening Express for Wednesday the 26th of November 1958 gives us homosexuality. Law will not be changed. The Home Secretary, Mr. R.A. Butler, moving in the Commons today, the government motion to take note of the Wolfenden Report on homosexual offences and prostitution, said the government were satisfied that they would not be justified at present in proposing legislation to carry out the committee's recommendations concerning homosexuality. Can we be certain, he said, that homosexual conduct between consenting adults is not a source of harm to others? A homosexual group, and I understand there are such groups, may well draw in and corrupt those who are ordinarily bisexual by nature and capable of living normal lives, but are led by curiosity, weakness, or in some cases purely mercenary motives into homosexual society. There is no doubt, from inquiries and researches which I have made, said Mr. Butler, that many people would at present misunderstand the removal of the prohibition as implying, if not approval, at least condemnation by the legislature of homosexual conduct. Interestingly, bisexuality is mentioned there, as though the speaker has somehow got his head around that being a potentially normal inclination for folk to have, and it might be in line with my mum's reaction to my outing my dual inclination at about the age of 15, where she responded with, well, at least there's still the chance of grandkids. Maybe bisexual was a perfectly acceptable way to be, provided there was still the chance that you were going to conform with a heterosexual relationship and provide the world with the 2.4 kids expected of you. In Aberdeen, as late as 1977, there were folk in court up on sodomy charges. The Aberdeen Press and Journal for the 9th of September 1977 has 2 in court at Peterhead. 2 Peterhead youths who appeared on indictment at Peterhead Sheriff Court yesterday on a charge of sodomy had their cases continued for 1 week for social inquiry reports. Robert Sjoberg, 19 years old, Uggy Street, and William Kinnear, 21 years old, Blackhouse Terrace, both admitted the offence, which took place in the playground at Peterhead's North School on August 19th. Though whether these charges were in some way hyped by the locus where it took place, I couldn't tell you. I would think that would be seen as an aggravating factor. An interesting wee bit of history is included relating to a how-to manual James VI wrote for his son Henry. It's in an article devoted to women's rights. The Aberdeen Evening Express for the 16th of July 1979 has, with women crying out for liberation and equality, here's a bit of male chauvinist advice on how to treat your wife that would bring outraged howls of protest from women's libbers. Treat her as your own flesh. Command her as her lord, cherish her as your helper, rule her as your pupil, and please her in all things reasonable. The man who said that had no fears of violent reaction from his wife or anyone else, for it was written in the 16th century by King James VI. Down through the centuries, men have passed on fatherly advice to their sons, and King James was no exception. In Basilicon Doron, one of 2 books he wrote about kingship, he told Henry, his dearest son and natural successor, to gain his subjects' obedience, first by the severity of his justice, and then win their hearts by tempering justice with mercy. There were certain crimes which a king was bound never to forgive: witchcraft, wilful murder, incest, sodomy, poisoning, and false coin. The sodomy is a curious inclusion, for James himself had homosexual tendencies. I was hoping to come across older articles with regards to homosexual women, but what do you search for? There was this article distinguishing grim women from their masculine or feminine counterparts. This is from the Fifeshire Journal for Thursday 24th of December 1868. Grim females. Almost all histories and mythologies embody the idea of a race of grim females, whether as fabulous and complex monsters like the Sphinx and the Harpies, or the more human forms of the Fates and the Furies. Unsexed women have been universally recognised as forming part of the system of nature, and to be accepted among the stranger manifestations of human life. Yet it is hard to understand why they should exist at all. As moral sports, extravagancies, exaggerations, they are so far interesting to the anthropologist, but as women with definite duties and fixed functions, nothing can be more admirable. They are even worse than effeminate men, which is saying everything. The grim female must be carefully distinguished from the masculine woman, for they are by no means essentially the same, though the types may run into each other and sometimes do. One characteristic of the grim female is her want of any of the womanly passion for children. She may have so much maternal instinct perverted as to be on friendly terms with a dog or 2, a cat, or maybe a cockatoo, but she has no real affection for children, no comprehension of child nature, and the sublime nonsense of the nursery is a thing unknown to her from first to last. Sign me up as a grim female, huh? In the end, I was spending hours going through articles with the search term "to woman" in a bid to try and find any information. I did come across a suggestive piece that's fairly racist towards the young female whistleblower in the case, with the search "to ladies." The article doesn't particularly state anything too obviously, but the inference is there of what the 2 ladies in question had been libelled with. The Aberdeen Press and Journal for the 13th of June 1929 gives us "Secret of the Law. Case that shook Edinburgh 100 years ago." Mr. Roughhead, writing in the June quarterly number of the Juridical Review, Green and Son, 5 shillings, recalls a scandal in Edinburgh in the year 1810 which, although it was before the Court of Session in the House of Lords for several years, was altogether omitted from the official reports and the legal literature of the time. The case was heard in camera, and the court ordered that the documents should be destroyed. It happened, however, the famous John Clerk, Lord Eldon, was one of the counsel in the case, and he preserved his papers, as indeed it has since been found did another advocate. Mrs. Woods and Perry, 2 ladies, kept a school for the daughters of gentlemen in Drumshoek Gardens. Unfortunately for themselves, they admitted it to Jane, an illegitimate granddaughter of Dame Helen Cumming-Gordon, relict or widow of Sir Alexander Cumming-Gordon of Altar in Gordonston. She was half-caste, her mother having been an Indian woman and her father a son of Lady Cumming-Gordon. This girl made serious moral allegations against the 2 teachers, allegations which, the author says, could only have originated in her Eastern mentality. As a consequence, all their pupils were withdrawn and they were ruined. They sought reparation from Dame Cumming-Gordon to the amount of £10,000. The lady fought them tooth and nail for years, greatly to Mr. Roughhead's indignation, for, with the majority of the judges, he avers that the girl was a perverted liar, and that her grandmother's actions were an aggravation of the circumstances. In the end, 11 years afterwards, the dowager paid up £3,500 and the case was withdrawn. But until now, nothing has ever appeared in print regarding a cause célèbre which shook the Edinburgh aristocracy. Now, strangely, I couldn't even find a whisper of their mention from 1800 to 1900 in the papers, so it really must have been a well-kept secret. Even the name of the hounded Lady Cumming-Gordon was searched for with no suggestive articles found. It clearly outlines why there wasn't the same perspective against women as there was against men. Basically, men couldn't conceive of 2 women seeking and enjoying an intimate relationship with each other outside of a perverted liar's Eastern mentality. In searching for a lesbian couple, the first article we come across is from 1978, and it contains more of the shameful language shown previously against those male victims of society's misguided perspectives. This is from the Aberdeen Evening Express for the 6th of January 1978. Outlaw horrific lesbian families, says top Tory. A top Tory today demanded legislation to outlaw the horrific practice of providing lesbian couples with children by artificial insemination. Dr. Rhodes Boyson, an opposition education spokesman, said, "To bring children into this world without a natural father is evil and selfish. This evil must stop for the sake of the potential children in society, which both have enough problems without the extension of this horrific practice." Dr. Boyson, MP for North Brent, went on, "Children have a right to be born into a natural family with a father and mother. Anything less is not only against God's law, but will cause lifelong deprivation of the most acute kind to the child. If the medical profession itself will not take action against doctors who take part in this practice, then the state must step in and end it by legislation." Dr. Boyson's comments follows the disclosure yesterday that 6 lesbian couples have had children by artificial insemination. Sappho, a London-based lesbian organisation, said the couples were referred to a London doctor willing to help them, and all had had marvellous super kids. Mrs. Jackie Forster, a founder member of Sappho, said this help should be available all over the country on the National Health Service. The doctor involved is said to be away on holiday and unavailable for comment. Sir George Young, Conservative MP for Ealing Acton, in whose constituency the doctor lives, said today that he had written to the Health Minister David Ennals asking him if he will contact the British Medical Association and draw up some guidelines to curb this activity. In my view, artificial insemination should only be used in the context of a stable and normal family. There was an interesting debate with regards homosexual literature from the Aberdeen Press in 1978. The against faction based their arguments on the "but God said" principle, as well as one which correlates homosexuality to cannibalism, and the last which is particularly patronising and demeaning. I'll begin with the letter from Uslina Stott. Uslina Stott, from what I've been able to find out about her, seemed to believe she had a direct conduit to God, that she was in direct communication with, to her, the creator of the universe. Her letter from the Aberdeen Evening Express for the 23rd of March 1978 reads, "There is no neutral ground. It is ridiculous of Aberdeen lesbian group to deny that homosexuals corrupt the young. We know they do. All propagandist activity is aimed at making converts to one's cause. I preach the gospel because I want everyone, young and old, to know Christ as their saviour. My cause is good because it is of God. The homosexual cause is evil and is condemned by God. Those in favour of homosexuality are against God. Those who think they can be neutral are also against God. There is no neutral ground where Christ is concerned. We are either for him or against him. The Bible tells us that holiness is not infectious, but evil is. The devil, being a liar, likes to give his works names that conceal their true character from the foolish. He calls homosexuality, which leads to depression, suicide and murder, gay. It is indeed truer to call homosexuals queer, their word, not mine, for their behaviour is unnatural and perverted. Homosexual men and lesbian women are people who have willfully chosen to depart from what is normal. When God made a helpmeet for the first man, Adam, he didn't make another man, he made a woman. Heterosexuality is normality. Homosexuals dishonour their own bodies between themselves, being given up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts and vile affections. They know that God's judgment says they are worthy of death, but they deliberately put this knowledge out their minds, preferring their sin. That's from Uslina Stott of Aberdeen. The one response that I'll read for you is actually in poem form, and we know there's always a poem somewhere in our Independence Live episodes. This is entitled, "Judge Not, Lest Ye... A reply to the moral strictures of Mrs. Uslina Stott. Oh dear, Mrs. Stott, stern rebuker of sin, what a state of self-righteousness now you are in. You take on the note of a moral improver, but end up as simply a joyless reprover. Of your own rectitude so completely sure, infallibly judge of what's bad, what is pure. But think for a wee, if you do go to heaven, your stern moral judgments you may have to leave in. Let's recall to your memory a biblical scene. You surely have read of the poor Magdalene, whom the stern uncle good of an ancient society wished to stone unto death as a mark of their piety. Who was it that then put an end to their din by asking which of them had never known sin? And who's to decide what is good, what is bad? Was not Noah himself a bit of a lad? What happened when young Ham discovered his dad lying drunk and incapable and what's more, unclad? His two other brothers he backwards then led. They covered him up, eyes averted, then fled. Poor Ham, for his pains, which his father did save, was told his descendants would all live to slave. What comfort he might have found in that hour, had he glimpsed in the future the dawn of black power. He'd have said to himself, be I black, be I white, to hell with the bigots, I'll do what is right. What I think is right, not what bigots command. I will sing my own song, I will join my own band. Oh, poor Mrs. Stott, in your sterilised bower, your song is so bitter, your outlook so sour, too much exercised over others' transgressions. Why not now engage in some frank self-confession? There's a phrase you must know, it says, God is love. The trouble is, some folk think God's high above. Bring your faith down to earth, don't be so damned sure that you're God's deputy, only you are pure. It might make a dent in your own self-conceit, but you'd be much more human, more nearly complete. Have a go, Mrs. Stott, learn to laugh and then play. If you try hard enough, you might even get gay. And that's from RSH Cooney of Aberdeen. Homosexuality was eventually legalised in Section 80 of the Criminal Justice Scotland Act for 1980, and this was enacted from the 1st of February 1981, but some didn't take this legislation well. The Aberdeen Evening Express for the 15th of November 1982 has "Keep them in the closet." The silent majority remaining true to form, perhaps I may be allowed to speak for them and to say something in defence of those counsellors who are being pilloried by your homosexual readers and their apologists. Britain is relatively tolerant of minority groups, even when at their most vociferous, until, that is, they are considered to pose a threat to the well-established mores instituted by us, the silent majority. When there is reason to believe that such threat exists, it is incumbent upon our elected representatives nationally and locally to take action on our behalf to contain the threat. It may be that, on occasion, our mentors are overzealous. However, I would suggest that many of us are concerned that a too liberal attitude towards the gay lib movement could result in an erosion of some of those standards we have been at pains to establish. It has been argued that homosexual behaviour is covert, and that if it occurs between consenting adults it harms no one and should not claim that they were being discriminated against, for they would go unrecognised. So by this reckoning, some of their public behaviour must be offensive to the rest of us, and we, being in the majority, have the democratic right to minimise the nuisance. By definition and inclination, homosexuals are deviants, and like other deviant groups, whether they be criminals, religious freaks, political extremists, or whatever, they have to recognise that conformity is the name of the game, and that behaviour cannot be tolerated which is calculated to significantly violate the norms of the society in which they choose to live. It has to be admitted that many attitudes in an anti-homosexual stance is before the event phenomena, but it should be remembered that the consensus is that homosexual behaviour is learned behaviour, there being little to suggest that a hormonal imbalance is the cause, and if it were genetic, it would have been bred out of the race generations ago. So we are particularly concerned that our male children are not seduced, for sodomy is as unnatural and as abhorrent to us now as it was when it received the name. At a more personal level, we don't enjoy being embarrassed by homosexuals and are uneasy in their company, and this explains in part the reluctance to appear too sanguine at the prospect of them gaining the full integration they seek. The destiny which shapes our ends has seen fit to ensure that a certain conjunction of them gives mutual pleasure and propagates the race, that a minority find pleasure in an unnatural conjunction which does not, is a reprehensible fact which we would like to keep in the closet as long as possible. Thank you, L. Bingham from Aberdeen. After the millennium, a whole slew of rights and amendments were enacted to protect those in the LGBTQ+ community. In 2004, we had the Gender Recognition Act. In 2005, civil partnerships were made available. In 2009, adoption and parental rights were given. In 2010, we had protection from discrimination. In 2014, same-sex marriage was made available. In 2018, the X-sex descriptor on ID documents was made available, and the transition minimum age was reduced to 16. And in June of 2018, the Scottish Parliament passed the Historical Sexual Offences, Pardons and Disregards Act for 2018. The Scotland of today is a fairly liberal and accepting country to which those facing persecution in other countries are free to come for asylum and acceptance. Pride marches and celebrations are there to show how we've progressed and to embrace each other as just other facets of humanity. To those seeking more information, either check out the far fuller post that I've created, Pride in Scottish History, which I'll try and have linked in the description below, but it will be posted on Facebook and Twitter and the usual places you find random Scottish history. Or you can come in person to the Women's Library here in Bridgeton, near where we are on Lindressy Street by Bridgeton Cross. And they have a whole LGBTQ+ section. They also have an online resource site which again I'll try and have linked in the description below. So, thank you for joining me for this episode, and there will likely be a part 2 of this because there's a whole section of this society that we haven't been able to speak about with the time we have, and that is the transsexual community. So we'll cover that next time. Alright, take care. Why is my nose going at you? Is it because I am talking? I think I need to sneeze too. Oh. Oh my god. Okay. Oh no, I'm just hot. Wonderful. Oh. Mrs. Woods and Perry, 2 ladies, kept a school for the daughters of gentlemen.